Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases in history. Today, we're going to look into the dark corners of Indiana, where strange things happened in the winter of 1903 that can't be explained. Before we move on, we need to make something very clear. This video is a work of fiction made just for fun. There is no connection between this and real people, living or dead. At the start of the 20th century, Indiana was going through a lot of changes. Farms were still the most common thing in the area, but small towns were starting to grow thanks to the railroads that ran through the area. Tippecanoe County, which is in the middle of the state, was known for its rich soil and peaceful towns. The main city, Lafayette, had dirt roads that turned to mud in the spring. People there knew each other by name, went to the same churches, and shopped at the same stores. It was a place where things seemed to stay the same until that night in February. The temperature had dropped below zero, and the cold wind from the north made people feel uneasy. People who lived in the countryside, where winters are usually harsh, went home early to warm up by their wood-burning fireplaces. But something else was about to happen that would change how people in that community felt about safety forever. The Hartwell property was about 12 kilometers from town, on a side road that twisted between fields and oak trees that were sleeping in the winter. People knew that Margaret and Thomas Hartwell were hard workers who kept to themselves. He took care of the small farm, and she sold preserves at the local market and kept the house in good shape. They had lived there for almost 20 years, since they got married in a simple ceremony at the Lafayette Methodist Church. The seasons and the work on the land set a pattern for their lives. Thomas had gone to town that night in 1903 to get supplies. It wasn't unusual for Margaret to be left alone on the property. She was used to being alone for short periods of time, with only the fire crackling and the wind howling through the cracks in the windows to break the silence. But when Thomas came back hours later, something was very wrong. The front door was open a little bit and the cold wind made it sway. The snow that had started to fall made little piles on the floor of the entrance. He said his wife's name, but there was no answer. He called again, this time more urgently, but still nothing. The house was in a strange state of disarray. It didn't look like there had been a fight or a violent break-in. Someone had been looking for something in particular, moving things around on purpose, but not too quickly. The drawers were open, the papers were all over the kitchen table, and someone had broken into the wooden chest in the bedroom. And Margaret just wasn't there. Thomas ran to the next property, which was more than 3 kilometers away. Mr. Whitmore, a farmer who had known the Hartwells for years, rode right away to Lafayette to tell the sheriff. It was after midnight when the police got there. The snow was falling harder, covering up any tracks that might have been there. Sheriff Coleman, a middle-aged man with decades of experience, looked at the scene with more and more confusion. There were no broken windows, locks that had been forced open, or other signs of forced entry. The person who came into the house either had a key or was invited in. But the lack of clear footprints was the most troubling thing. The only footprints in the snow around the house were from Thomas's boots and the horses of the police. How could someone have left without leaving any evidence? In the days that followed, there were more questions than answers. Searches were planned, and dozens of volunteers combed the woods and fields around the area. They didn't find anything. That winter night, Margaret seemed to have melted away into the cold air. And then the reports started to come in, disturbing reports that would turn this mystery into something much darker than just someone going missing without a trace. The first rumors started to spread through Lafayette's warehouses and taverns. People would whisper quietly or stop talking when strangers came near. That week, something in the air made people feel uneasy. It seemed like winter was lasting longer and the cold was getting worse. Then came the first official report, which would add new levels of mystery. 3 days after the events at Hartwell Farm, a woman named Helena Crane went to Sheriff Coleman. Helena was a teacher at the town school. and was well liked because she was calm and level-headed. She paused before speaking, clearly not comfortable with what she was about to say. She said that on the same night as the event, around 8 o'clock, she had seen something strange while walking home from a church meeting. A carriage she didn't know passed her on the main street, going toward the road that led to the Hartwell estate. 2 black horses pulled the car, which was much too fancy for that part of the country. The driver wore a hat with a wide brim that hid his face, and there was someone in the back who was also wearing dark cloaks. What caught her attention was the speed. The carriage moved very quickly, especially considering how bad the roads were that cold night. Helena didn't care much about the issue until she heard about what happened at the farm. The picture of that strange carriage kept coming back to her mind. Sheriff Coleman wrote down the statement, but he wasn't sure what to do with it. Carriages went through Lafayette all the time, carrying travelers, merchants, and people going from one town to another. But there was something about that story that bothered him. After that, more testimonies came out. Mr. Pembroke, who ran the hotel in downtown Lafayette, remembered a strange guest who had checked in 2 days before the events. He was a middle-aged man who was well-dressed and spoke with an accent that Pembroke couldn't quite place. It could have been from the East or from somewhere else. The man had paid for 3 nights but left suddenly the morning after the events at Hartwell Farm, leaving his last night unused. The hotel register had a name that sounded fake. Jonathan Stone. There was no permanent address, just a note that he worked in a business related to land. Pembroke remembered that the man had asked about the rural properties near Lafayette, especially the ones that were more secluded. The hotelier felt uneasy about the way he spoke, but he couldn't put his finger on what it was. Sheriff Coleman started to put together these pieces. Helena Crane's elegant carriage, the mysterious guest who had left suddenly, the house that had been ransacked as if someone was looking for something specific, and the fact that Margaret Hartwell was still missing, which was still a mystery. There was a pattern there, but it was still too vague to make sense of. Thomas Hartwell, lost in silent despair, started to go over every little thing that had happened in the past few weeks. He was troubled by a memory he couldn't quite put his finger on. About 10 days before that terrible night, Margaret got a letter. She didn't say much about what was in it, just that it was from a cousin she hadn't seen in years. Thomas didn't think it was very important at the time. That letter meant something else now. He looked everywhere in the house for the mail, going through every drawer, chest, and corner where Margaret might have put it. Nothing. The letter was gone, just like all of the other personal papers Margaret kept in a small metal box with other important papers and memories. When Thomas finally found the box, it was empty and hidden under a loose floorboard in the bedroom. All the way empty. Sheriff Coleman paid more attention to this new piece of information. A strange letter, missing papers, a stranger asking questions about rural properties, and a fancy carriage on the night of the events. The pieces were starting to look like something more complicated than anyone had thought at first. It wasn't something that happened by chance or on the spur of the moment. It was planned ahead of time, but for what reason? Local newspapers started printing short articles about the case. The Lafayette Journal had separate headlines that didn't sensationalize the news but reported the facts as they were known. Other magazines from nearby towns copied the information. Letters started to come to the sheriff's office soon after. People from other parts of Indiana said they had similar problems. People going missing for no reason, homes being broken into, and strangers asking about land and property. There was a pattern forming in the fog, and it pointed to something much bigger than just one event on a farm in Tippecanoe County. The thaw came with spring, and the investigation took a turn for the better when a new piece of evidence was found. Albert Sutton, a farmer who worked land west of Lafayette, found something while plowing a field that hadn't been used all winter. A leather trunk with dozens of documents, Contracts, deeds, certificates, all related to properties in different counties of Indiana, was buried shallowly and covered in tarpaulin. Sheriff Coleman looked at the things inside with more and more interest. At first glance, the papers looked real because they had official seals and fancy signatures. But something was off. The dates didn't match the public records of the counties in question. Some of the properties that were listed in the papers weren't on official maps. Others belonged to people different from those named in the documents found. It was a very advanced fake business. Someone was creating fraudulent land-related documents, likely to sell them to unsuspecting buyers or to claim properties that didn't belong to them. And somehow, Margaret Hartwell was connected to it all. But how? She was just a farmer who sold jams and jellies at the market. Was there something in her past that Thomas didn't know about? The sheriff decided to investigate Margaret's life more thoroughly. Before they got married, he found out that she was from Terre Haute, a town in southern Indiana where she lived until she was in her early 20s. Coleman traveled there, a full day's train journey, and began asking questions in the right places. He was surprised by what he found. Margaret, who was born Ashwood, had worked as a clerk in a law office for a few years. Her handwriting was perfect, and she knew a lot about legal documents. 6 years earlier, the lawyer she had worked for, Edmund Price, had died. But her co-workers who still lived in Terre Haute remembered her well. She was smart, detail-oriented, and had a unique talent for copying handwriting and understanding the details of contracts and deeds. One of her old co-workers, who was honest but didn't want to say anything, said that there had been rumors at the time about problems in Edmund Price's office. There are no formal accusations or proof, but there are rumors that some of the documents made there had information that was not reliable. Margaret left Terre Haute without warning, soon after Price died, and never came back. Coleman came back to Lafayette with a new point of view. People who were involved in document fraud wanted Margaret because she had skills that made her useful. Maybe her past had finally caught up with her. Someone may have known what she could do and sought her out, either to force her into a plan or to keep her quiet, because she knew too much about past operations. Thomas Hartwell was heartbroken to learn these things. His wife had never said anything specific about his job in Terre Haute, other than that he had worked as an office assistant. He never thought that there were secrets in those years before they got married. But now, in a creepy way, everything made sense. The strange letter, the missing personal papers, and the stranger's interest in the property. At the same time, more reports came in from other parts of the state. In 1902, a woman in Fort Wayne had to leave her home for the same reasons. Her house was ransacked, some of her things were missing, and there was no trace of her. In 1900, a man in Evansville who was known for working with land records just stopped going to work. There were signs that someone had carefully searched his house, but nothing of obvious value had been taken. Sheriff Coleman started writing to officials in these other areas. A bigger pattern started to show up. There were clerks, registrars, and people who knew a lot about how the legal systems for transferring land worked. Everyone who was involved had something to do with property documentation, and they had all left in ways that made it seem like they didn't want to leave. There was a group behind it, a network that worked across county lines, maybe even across the whole state. People were being hired, forced to work, or killed based on how useful or dangerous they were. And this network was smart enough to leave no solid proof, just absences and questions. Coleman got a letter in late April 1903 that didn't have a name on it. The envelope didn't have a return address, but the postmark said Indianapolis. There was only one piece of paper inside, with a message written in carefully printed letters that weren't cursive. The message was short but clear. Search in Monroe County. Abandoned house near Bloomington. Monday at noon. come alone. It was clearly a trap, but it was also the first direct lead he'd gotten in weeks. Coleman knew he had to follow that thread, no matter how dangerous it seemed. Sheriff Coleman set off for Bloomington on a gray Monday morning, carrying only a gun and a deep sense of uncertainty. It took the train several hours to get to Monroe County. The train went through rolling hills and thick forests that were typical of that part of Indiana. Bloomington was a university town that was busier than Lafayette. The streets were paved downtown, and there was an air of intellectual progress that was very different from the rural mystery Coleman was looking into. He rented a horse and rode out of town following the vague directions in the anonymous letter. The empty house was on a side road that went through groves of walnuts and oaks. The place looked just like the description. A run-down wooden building with broken windows and a roof that was falling down. It was clear that no one had lived there in a long time. The fence around the area was broken, and plants had taken over what used to be a garden. Coleman tied his horse to a tree far away and walked up slowly. There was no sound except for the wind rustling through the leaves and the birds singing. There were no signs of people, no carriages, and no horses except for his own. He waited. It was noon, then 1 hour, then 2 hours. No one showed up. Coleman went into the empty house because he didn't want to waste the trip. The inside smelled like mold and wood that was rotting. There were broken pieces of furniture all over the rooms, and the wallpaper was peeling off the walls like dead skin. But as he walked around the first floor, he noticed something. In the corner of the main room, the floor looked different. The boards there were cleaner and had less dust and dirt on them. He got down on one knee and looked at it more closely. Some of the planks were loose, which showed that they had been taken off and put back on recently. Coleman carefully lifted them up, and there was an empty space underneath. He also found another chest inside this hiding place. It was smaller than the one Albert Sutton found, but it was just as important. This trunk had more papers in it, but they were different. They were letters or correspondence that people had been sending and receiving for months or even years. Coleman started to read, and a complicated story began to unfold. The letters talked about operations in different counties. They talked about buying and selling things using code words that barely hid illegal activities. There were mentions of people whose names were only initials or nicknames. Coleman was sure that M.A. in one letter referred to Margaret Ashford, who was now Hartwell, because of the context and dates. The letter from 1901 said that M.A. had become a problem because she knew too much about old operations and had left the group without asking for permission first. It said that the situation would have to be fixed eventually, but that there was time because she seemed to be living peacefully on a farm far away. Other letters showed how big the network was. At least 7 counties in Indiana had people who were involved. The operation's main goal was to make fake documents for properties that weren't worth much, like land that was in a legal dispute or whose original owners had died without leaving clear heirs. The forgers then sold these properties to people in other parts of the state or even other states. These buyers had no way to easily check the documents' validity. Coleman realized that he had proof of a criminal conspiracy that had been going on for years. But who put that chest there? Who wrote the letter without signing it? And why was someone in the organization trying to expose her? Or was it an attempt to steer the investigation in certain directions while hiding something bigger? Coleman heard footsteps outside the house while he was going through the last documents in the trunk. These were not the casual steps of a curious onlooker, but rather deliberate, measured steps. Someone was aware of his presence. He instinctively reached for the gun in its holster. He stood behind a wall that was only partially collapsed, where he could see the main entrance. A man of average height stood in the doorway. He was wearing simple clothes for a farm worker and a straw hat that covered part of his face. He stood there, clearly taking stock of the situation. Coleman stayed still and waited to see what the visitor wanted. Neither of them said anything for a long time. Finally, the man took off his hat, showing a face that had been weathered by time and work outside. His eyes were careful, but not angry. His voice was hoarse, like someone who wasn't used to talking for long periods of time. He said he was the one who sent the letter and that he had worked for the people who were involved in the forgery operation for years, at first thinking he was only helping with legal land deals. The man, who only gave his name as William, said that over time he had come to understand what the plan really was. They threatened his family when he tried to leave. He kept going because he was afraid, but guilt ate him up inside. The last straw for Margaret Hartwell was what happened to her. He knew about the plans to go to the farm that night in February, but he didn't have the guts to tell anyone in time. He had to deal with that now. Coleman paid more and more attention as he listened. William said that 3 men in Indianapolis ran the group. They looked good on the outside and were involved in real estate deals, but they were running a scam in the background. They hired people like William to do the dirty work for them so that they could stay far enough away to not be suspected. From her time working in Terre Haute, Margaret knew who at least 2 of these leaders were. That's why it was dangerous for her to try to move on from that life. Was Margaret still alive? The sheriff asked. William thought for a moment and then shook his head slowly. He had no idea. He had been told to help look for the papers she kept, but he wasn't directly involved in what happened that night. He only knew that they wanted to permanently silence her and get back any evidence she might have kept from her time in Terre Haute. He didn't know if they had succeeded or not. Coleman felt both angry and more determined than ever. He wanted to know the names of the people in charge in Indianapolis. William pulled back, clearly scared. Giving those names would mean signing his own death warrant. He had already put himself in too much danger by telling what he knew. But he made a deal. He would tell the sheriff where other hideouts were where incriminating documents were kept. This would be enough evidence to expose the operation, even if he didn't name the leaders. William also said that there were rumors going around the organization that Margaret wasn't the only person who had been targeted recently. This is more important. The organization was keeping an eye on 2 other people in different counties because they knew too much, or had skills that the organization wanted but was also afraid of. One worked as a registrar in Vincennes, and the other worked as a clerk in Richmond. Both were in grave danger. Coleman made his choice quickly because he knew he had to do something before more people got hurt. He told William to make a map of the hideouts and give him any other helpful information. William agreed, and it was clear that he was happy that he could finally make up for his past mistakes. He used a piece of charcoal and some old paper he found in the abandoned house to make detailed maps and write down dates, place names, and descriptions of how the operation worked. It was already getting dark when they were done. William was the first to leave. He was nervous and kept looking back. Coleman waited an hour before leaving the empty house. He carefully put all the papers in his bag. Under a cold, starry sky, the trip back to Bloomington was made. He thought quickly about what he should do next. He had real proof now, but he also knew that he was dealing with dangerous and organized people. Coleman locked himself in his office for 2 days straight in Lafayette, carefully sorting through all the evidence he had gathered, including the letters from the Bloomington hideout, the documents found at Albert Sutton's camp, and the maps drawn by William. Everything was carefully organized and studied. From the mess of information, patterns began to appear, linking dates and places that kept coming up, a complicated web of dishonest behavior that had been going on for years. Coleman's discovery was much bigger than he had thought at first. The operation wasn't just in Indiana. There were also mentions of properties in Ohio and Illinois, which suggests that the network crossed state lines. The amounts were large. The group had moved the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars through these fake transactions over about 5 years, based on the dates on the documents. It was a huge criminal operation for that time. But Coleman had a problem. A lot of the evidence he had was circumstantial. For example, he had forged documents, but they didn't directly link him to the leaders in Indianapolis that William had talked about. Letters with initials and a secret language that any good lawyer could fight in court. And he only had the word of a scared man who wouldn't give his full name or testify in court. Coleman also knew that he was dealing with powerful people. Men who were involved in legal land deals would have political connections, money, and the ability to hire the best lawyers. A quick and poorly supported accusation could not only lead to his legal defeat but also end his career. He needed something more solid, something that couldn't be denied. The answer came from a place you wouldn't expect. A week after he got back from Bloomington, a reporter from Indianapolis came to see Coleman. The man, who said his name was Samuel Brennan, worked for the Indianapolis News and had been looking into problems with land deals for months. Brennan had followed clues that led him to Lafayette in the Margaret Hartwell case. He thought there was a bigger story there that his paper would want to publish. At first, Coleman was unsure. Journalists could be helpful or hurtful, especially in sensitive cases, but Brennan showed that he was well informed and really cared about the truth. He brought his own files, which included newspaper articles about shady property sales, public records that didn't make sense when looked at closely, and names of people who had lost money in scams. They started to compare information with each other. Brennan's data added to Coleman's evidence in some interesting ways. The journalist had names. 3 men from Indianapolis who were part of the land deal. Harrison Blackwood is the owner of a well-known real estate company. Vincent Ashmore is a lawyer who works on land issues. And Douglas Merrick, who was an employee of the Marion County Records Office. All of them had what seemed to be perfect reputations and connections that made it very dangerous to make direct accusations. Brennan said he had thought these 3 were guilty for months, but hadn't been able to find enough proof. Every time he got closer to something real, the leads went cold. Witnesses changed what they said or just went away. Records that were once public disappeared. It felt like fighting ghosts. But now, with the physical evidence Coleman had in his journalistic work, they might have a chance to reveal the operation. The 2 men came up with a plan. Brennan would write a series of articles for the Indianapolis News about property fraud cases, starting with general ones and not naming the main suspects right away. This would let the public and other possible victims know about it and encourage them to come forward. At the same time, Coleman would use his connections with sheriffs from other counties to organize searches of the hideouts William had pointed out, gathering more proof before the group could get rid of it. One morning in May, Brennan's first article came out. It said, "Ghost Properties: How Non-Existent Land is Sold to Innocent Buyers." The text went into detail about specific cases without giving away too much information about the sources or evidence, but it was clear that an investigation was going on. The answer came quickly and was big. Many people called both the newspaper and the police to say they had been victims of similar scams. A farmer from Muncie said he bought a piece of land through middlemen in Indianapolis, but years later he found out that the papers were fake and the land really belonged to someone else. A widow from Terre Haute said that her husband lost his savings in a fake land deal just before he died in 1901. The stories kept coming in, and each one made the investigation stronger. Coleman took advantage of this surge of public interest to carry out his part of the plan. He worked with sheriffs from 5 different counties to carry out operations at the same time in order to get to the hideouts William had told him about. They found an empty barn in Shelbyville with ledgers that showed transactions over 3 years. In Columbus, An old attic held letters between members of the group talking about how to find new forgers. They found tools for forgery in Madison, such as fake official seals, printing types, and special inks used in government documents. Each new piece of evidence made the case stronger, but it also showed how complicated the operation was. These people weren't just criminals. They had put a lot of time, money, and thought into making a system that worked well for years without being caught. And this made me think of a scary question. How many other operations like this were going on in other states that no one could see until someone finally pulled the right thread? Coleman couldn't forget why he started his investigation in the first place. Margaret Hartwell, where was she? What really happened that night in February? Thomas Hartwell went to the sheriff's office every week to get updates and hope for news. Coleman had to admit that even though they had made a lot of progress in figuring out the bigger picture, they still didn't know what happened to Margaret. He started looking into properties in Indianapolis that were owned by or linked to the 3 men he thought were guilty. Blackwood owned a warehouse near the White River that he officially used to store old papers for his business. Ashmore had a second office in a part of the city that wasn't as busy. Merrick owned a country house in Morgan County, where he was said to spend weekends. Coleman needed permission from the law to search these places, which meant he had to convince a judge that there was a good reason to do so. The circumstantial evidence he had might not be enough. But then, something happened that changed everything. This one in Franklin, one of the hideouts that was looked into, had a diary. Not a cold record of transactions, but personal notes written by someone in the company over the course of months. The diary did not say who wrote it, but it did say what happened, when it happened, who was there, and where it happened. There was a direct reference in the entry from February 1903. It said, "This week, Blackwood ordered the Terre Haute problem to be solved. Ashmore arranged for transportation. The final location is the Merrick property in Morgan County. This is a permanent situation." Coleman read that entry over and over again, and it gave him chills. Blackwood clearly meant Harrison Blackwood. Vincent Ashmore was Ashmore. In this case, Terre Haute could only mean someone from there. Margaret. And Merrick property in Morgan County must have meant Douglas Merrick's country house. Permanent situation was a scary phrase that didn't leave much room for positive interpretations. He went straight to a judge in Lafayette with the diary. The judge was an old man named Thornton, who he knew well and trusted. He went over the whole investigation, showed him the diary entry, and presented all the evidence that had been gathered. For hours, Judge Thornton looked over everything, asked questions, and asked for more information. Finally, late at night, he signed search warrants for the 3 homes in Morgan County and Indianapolis. Coleman put together a group of 6 men he could trust, including 2 sheriffs from nearby counties who had helped with previous searches. At dawn, they left for Morgan County. They chose to start with Merrick's property because it was the most remote and least likely to have witnesses who could warn the suspects. The trip took most of the day and went along country roads that wound through thick woods. Merrick's country house was in a clearing with tall trees all around it. It was a simple building made of dark wood, with a porch that went all the way around the front. When they got there, it looked empty. There was no smoke coming from the chimney, and there were no signs of recent activity. Coleman and his men moved slowly, weapons ready, not knowing what they would find. It was easy to break down the door, even though it was locked. The inside smelled like mold and not being used, and the furniture was covered in dust. It was clear that no one had been there in weeks, maybe even months. They carefully looked through every room: the living room, the kitchen, the 2 bedrooms, and a small attic. There wasn't anything interesting in the main areas. But then one of the men saw something in the basement. A door that looked like it led to a coal storage area or depot. It was hidden behind shelves that, when moved, showed the way in. Coleman went down the wooden steps with a flashlight, and 2 of his men followed him. The basement was small, had a low ceiling, and a floor made of dirt, and there, in the very back corner, they found something that confirmed all of Coleman's worries that had grown during the investigation. There were fresh marks on the packed earth floor, places where the soil had been disturbed and then poorly hidden. Coleman's heart raced as he knelt down to look more closely. There was a pattern and a purpose behind the marks. They weren't just random. It wasn't long ago that someone had dug there. He told his men to get tools from the carriage, and they started digging carefully. They found something wrapped in canvas only a few inches deep. Coleman paused for a moment before opening the package because he was afraid of what he might find. But when he finally did, he found things that belonged to him: women's clothes, a leather purse, folded papers, and a small metal box that he knew right away. It was the box that Thomas Hartwell had talked about, the one where Margaret kept her important papers and memories. Coleman opened the box with shaking hands. There were old letters, some faded photos, and papers that proved everything he had thought. Margaret had written down what she did in Terre Haute, including notes on shady deals she saw happen in the office of lawyer Edmund Price. Names of people involved like Harrison Blackwood and Vincent Ashmore, who seemed to have been running similar schemes even back then. She had written down everything, maybe at first as a safety measure, or maybe because she thought this information might be useful or necessary one day. But the fact that those things were buried there and hidden so well told a dark story. Coleman felt like he had a heavy weight on his chest. The search of the property went on for hours, but they didn't need to find anything else to figure out what had happened. The documentary evidence alone made things look very bad. Margaret had never been anywhere else. People she had known years before had sealed her fate. They saw her as both a threat and a storehouse of dangerous secrets. Coleman sent his men away and took a moment to think about what would happen next. There was no need to keep bothering the place. It was clear what had happened. The diary's permanent situation had the worst possible meaning. He told the area to be secured and sent one of his men to get more county officials. The rest of the night was spent taking pictures of the scene and keeping the evidence safe. Coleman sat on the porch of Merrick's house, looking at the stars and thinking about how he would have to tell Thomas Hartwell the bad news. The man had been holding on to hope for months, but now it would all fall apart into a harsh reality. There was no longer any room for doubt or other options. The case was solved, but the solution only made things worse. More police came at dawn. The work of gathering evidence and writing down what happened was done carefully and with respect. Coleman took this time to look around the country house more closely. He found more papers in the attic, hidden between loose floorboards. Merrick and his accomplices wrote letters to each other about not only their illegal activities, but also how to handle problems that came up. Several letters specifically talked about Margaret. They knew where she lived, what she had done in the past, and how to shut her up for months. One letter from January 1903 spelled out the plan. Ashmore would send someone to give Margaret a fake message that would get her talking about her time in Terre Haute. Blackwood would give private transportation. Merrick would let them meet at his private property. Everything was very well planned and done with cold precision. People who knew Margaret's weaknesses and knew she felt guilty about things she had done in the past had tricked her. They could use that guilt to control her. Coleman made sure that everyone was arrested at the same time because the evidence was so strong. He sent a telegram to the police in Indianapolis with information and locations. Harrison Blackwood was taken into custody the next morning at his office in the city. Police caught Vincent Ashmore at his home. When Douglas Merrick found out that his Morgan County property was being looked into, He tried to escape by train to Chicago, but was caught at the station before he could even get on the train. In the months that followed, the trial was one of the most talked about in Indiana history. The evidence showed the full extent of the scam and what happened to Margaret. Everything, from documents and testimonies to financial records, was open to public view. The Indianapolis News had Samuel Brennan cover every day of the trial, and his articles were printed in papers all over the state. William, the man who had provided Coleman with crucial information, ended up testifying under protection. His testimony was very damaging, even though he spoke in a shaky voice and avoided looking at the accused. He talked about years of criminal activity, named other small players, and explained how they did it. His cooperation got him a shorter sentence, but it didn't take away the guilt he would feel for the rest of his life. Thomas Hartwell was at every trial session. Every day, he sat in the same chair and watched as the truth about what happened to his wife slowly came out. His expression rarely changed, but those who knew him perceived the transformation. The man who had been a quiet and optimistic farmer had become a darker figure, marked by a loss that transcended mere physical absence. The final decision was made in November 1903. Blackwood, Ashmore, and Merrick were all found guilty of a number of serious crimes. The sentences were harsh, lasting decades in prison. Other minor members of the group got different punishments. The operation to forge documents was shut down, but Coleman knew that similar operations were probably still going on in other parts of the country and had not yet been found. But Coleman still felt like something was missing after the case was officially closed. Yes, they had figured it out. Yes, they had found and punished the people who were to blame. But how many other people are missing whose stories will never be fully told? How many secrets are still hidden in remote homes, waiting to be found? Coleman had changed a lot because of the investigation. He started to see people in a more negative light, especially when it came to what they could do when money and power were at stake. He knew that the respectable surface of society often hid disturbing depths, and once you looked into those depths, you could never see the world the same way again. Lafayette was strangely quiet in the months after the trial. The city was back to its normal routine, but something had changed in the minds of everyone who lived there. People talked differently in warehouses and on the streets. People became more aware that even in small, safe-looking communities there could be danger around every corner. The innocence of a simpler time had been forever shaken. In the spring of 1904, Thomas Hartwell sold the farm. He couldn't live there anymore because so many memories were mixed up with the painful truth he had found. He moved to a smaller town in the southern part of the state to get a fresh start. He knew it would be hard, but he had to try. Before he left, he saw Coleman one last time and thanked him for looking for the truth, even when it took him to such dark places. Coleman kept being sheriff, but he saw things differently now. He started writing to officials in other states and counties on a regular basis, sharing what he had learned about criminal patterns, investigation methods, and warning signs during the Hartwell case. He became something of an unofficial expert on property fraud crimes and was called in to help with similar cases in other areas from time to time. In 1905, Samuel Brennan wrote a book about the case called Ghost Lands, the conspiracy that shook Indiana. The book brought together his newspaper articles and other information he found during and after the trial. The book did pretty well. It didn't make Brennan rich, but it did help him build his reputation as a serious investigative journalist. He wrote the book for Margaret Hartwell and the other people who were hurt by the criminal group. But there was one thing about the case that still bothered Coleman, a question that had never been fully answered. Why had Margaret kept those incriminating papers for so long? If she really wanted to leave her past behind when she married Thomas and moved to the farm, why didn't she get rid of all the proof that she had worked at the office in Terre Haute? Coleman thought about this question at night. Maybe Margaret knew she would need that information to protect herself one day. Maybe she kept the papers as a way to protect herself, hoping that her deep understanding of the criminal activities would make her too valuable to kill. Or maybe she just felt guilty for being involved, even if it was against her will or under duress. The documents were a way for her to make up for it, a silent promise that she would eventually use that knowledge to bring justice. No matter what the reason, her choice to keep the papers ended up being both her downfall and the key to bringing down the whole criminal operation. Coleman couldn't help but see the tragic irony in this. Margaret had been quiet, but her death made sure that the people who hurt her would have to face the music. Coleman got an unexpected letter in 1906. The letter was from a woman named Catherine Reynolds who lived in Richmond, Indiana. She said that she had read about the case in the news and in Brennan's book. Catherine had worked as a clerk in a number of offices over the years and had seen patterns that were similar to those in the reports. She thought someone was watching her, maybe even trying to get her to do something like that. She had papers that showed something was wrong, but she was afraid of what might happen if she tried to report it herself. Coleman went to Richmond right away. He met Catherine in a private hotel room, where she showed him proof of a fraud scheme involving mineral properties in eastern Indiana. It was smaller than Blackwood's operation, but it used the same methods: fake documents, fake sales, and hiring or forcing people with technical skills to work for them. Coleman helped Catherine get her evidence to the right people without putting herself in danger. The operation was looked into and then taken apart. This time, no one went missing, and no one was hurt. The Hartwell case taught people about witness protection and made it possible for people to be safe in ways that weren't possible before. This happened many times in the years that followed. People who knew what to look for because of what they read about the Margaret Hartwell case got help before things got bad. Coleman became a kind of safe place for these reports, working quietly with local law enforcement to look into and solve cases before they got worse and turned into tragedies. But not everything could be stopped. Coleman learned about another case in 1908. A woman in Evansville had gone missing in a way that was eerily similar to the Hartwell case. Her house was broken into, her papers were missing, and there was no sign of her. Coleman offered to help the local police by sharing everything he knew. The investigation did lead to a small criminal network, but they never found the missing person this time. There were still some things that were not clear. Coleman learned a hard truth from these experiences. No matter how hard he worked or how much he learned, there would always be cases that didn't get justice. There would always be things that needed to be answered. He could only keep trying, keep learning, and keep sharing what he knew in the hopes that each little success would save at least one life. William, the informant who gave important information in the first case, served his shorter sentence and was let go in 1909. After he got out of jail, Coleman met with him once. William looked different. He was thinner and had gray hair that had come in too early. He said he was thankful for the chance to make up for some of what he did, but he also said that the guilt would never go away completely. He moved to a state next door to get away from everyone and live out the rest of his days in peace. Helena Crane, the teacher who told the police about the strange carriage the night Margaret went missing, taught in Lafayette for many years after that. Sometimes she ran into Coleman on the street, and they said hello to each other in a friendly way. She never said anything directly about the case, but Coleman saw in her eyes that they both understood how a single moment of careful observation could change the course of an entire investigation. The three men who were found guilty in the first case stayed in jail. According to official records, Blackwood died in prison in 1912 of natural causes. Ashmore and Merrick served their sentences, and they were sometimes mentioned in small newspaper articles when they tried to appeal their sentences in court, but they always lost. Their families, who were embarrassed to be connected to convicted criminals, moved out of Indianapolis and changed their names to avoid the scandal. The Hartwell case never really ended for Coleman. It became a part of who he was, changing the way he thought about each new case and how he understood people. He came up with a new idea of justice that was both more cynical and more hopeful than before. It was cynical because he knew how cruel people could be, and hopeful because he had seen how hard work, paying attention to details, and refusing to believe convenient lies could finally bring the truth to light. Coleman started writing down his experiences as the years went by and he got older. He didn't do it to publish them, but so that future investigators could learn from them. He wrote a lot about the methods he used, the mistakes he made, and what he learned. The Hartwell case was a big part of these writings. It was a basic study of how patient and systematic investigation could reveal criminal conspiracy. The next 10 years brought big changes to Indiana and the rest of the country. The world that existed in 1903 began to feel more and more like a distant memory as technology improved and cities grew. Lafayette grew by adding new streets and replacing old warehouses with modern businesses. But for people who lived through that winter, the memories were still as clear as if they had happened yesterday. After more than 20 years as sheriff of Tippecanoe County, Coleman left his job in 1915. He wanted a simple farewell ceremony, and that's what he got. People from work and the community came to thank him for his hard work. Some people brought up specific cases he had solved, but the conversations always came back to the Hartwell case. It was what defined his legacy, for better or worse. Coleman spent his retirement organizing his personal files, which included decades of research, letters, and notes on methods and techniques. He gave a lot of this stuff to the county library so that future scholars could learn from it. But he kept some papers for himself, like letters from Thomas Hartwell that he wrote over the years after moving south. Thomas never got over losing Margaret. Even when he wrote about boring things in his new life, his letters to Coleman had a sad tone. He worked at a sawmill, lived in a small house, and didn't have many friends. Coleman could sense the loneliness in his words, but he didn't know how to make it go away. Some wounds were just too deep to ever heal. Thomas wrote something in one of his last letters, dated 1914, that stuck with Coleman. I live now knowing that the person I shared years of life with had secrets I never imagined. I don't blame her for it. We all have pasts we'd rather forget. But it's strange to realize that you can be next to someone every day and still not know them completely. We make assumptions about people. We create versions of them in our minds that fit what we want to believe. The truth is often more complicated and sadder. Coleman felt a strong connection to those words because they spoke to something basic about doing research. In each case, people had to peel back layers of assumptions to find truths they would rather keep hidden. They had to face the difference between how things look and how they really are. And a lot of the time, the truth didn't bring the comfort people thought it would. It only gave them knowledge, and knowledge could be a heavy burden to bear. Samuel Brennan kept working as a journalist and eventually became the editor of the Indianapolis News. Over the years, he and Coleman kept in touch from time to time. Brennan sometimes asked Coleman for help with cases he was looking into because he respected the former sheriff's point of view and experience. When the U.S. joined the war in Europe in 1917, Brennan wrote about how it affected small towns in Indiana. His writing always had the same deep investigative quality that the Hartwell case helped to develop. Eventually, the country house in Morgan County where Margaret was found was torn down. After her story got out, no one wanted to buy it or live there. After Merrick was arrested, the property went back to the state because he didn't pay his taxes. It stayed empty for years until the authorities decided it would be best to just get rid of it. The forest around it slowly took back the space, hiding any signs that a building had ever been there. But people who knew the story never looked at that area the same way again. Catherine Reynolds, the Richmond woman who had looked for Coleman in 1906, became a quiet supporter of changes to how property is registered. She worked with state lawmakers to make the checks stricter and the paperwork more open. Her contributions were small but important, as they helped close some of the gaps that allowed frauds like the Blackwood operation to happen. She never asked for public recognition for this work. She was happy to know she was making a difference. Coleman got an unexpected visit in 1920. A young reporter from Chicago was working on a series of articles about famous cases and crimes that have never been solved in the Midwest. He wanted to talk to Coleman about the Hartwell case to get points of view that weren't in public records or in Brennan's book. At first, Coleman wasn't sure if he wanted to go over those events again, but he eventually agreed because he saw the value in keeping institutional memory alive. The young reporter asked Coleman a question he hadn't expected during the interview, which lasted several hours over 2 days. Do you think cases like this still happen today? Sophisticated criminal operations hidden behind respectable facades? Coleman thought about the question before answering. He said yes. He thought there were still cases like this. People's basic nature hadn't changed. Some people would always be tempted to cheat if they could make money that way. The basic ideas stayed the same, but the methods and technologies that were available changed. The reporter then asked Coleman what he would tell investigators who were working on tough cases that seemed impossible to solve. Coleman took a long time to think before he spoke. He said that the most important thing was to never accept easy answers just because they were easy. Always ask questions, look for inconsistencies, and follow the evidence, even if it took you to places that made you uncomfortable. And maybe, most importantly, always remember that there were real people with real lives behind every case who were affected by what happened. Remembering that people are human helped keep things in perspective and give them meaning. In 1921, the young reporter's articles were published, which brought the Hartwell case back into the public eye. A new group of readers found the story and were drawn in by the mix of mystery, careful research, and shocking discoveries. Some people went to Lafayette just to see where the events happened, even though there wasn't much to see. The new owners of the Hartwell farm didn't want to talk about its past. The sheriff's office was still in the same building, but different people worked there. Coleman had mixed feelings about this new interest. He was glad that the lessons of the case were still fresh in his mind. Another part wanted people to remember Margaret Hartwell for more than just how she died. She was a whole person with hopes and fears, skills and flaws. Coleman thought it was unfair to reduce her life to the mystery of her disappearance, but he knew it was going to happen. Coleman thought about all the people whose lives had been affected by the case on quiet nights. Thomas Hartwell, who lived alone in sadness. William, who felt guilty for things he couldn't change. Helena Crane, whose casual comment became an important part of the investigation. Catherine Reynolds, who turned her own fear into a reason to fight for change. Samuel Brennan, who built a career on the painful truth he learned. And himself, Coleman, whose ideas about justice and human nature had been permanently changed. The things that happened that winter of 1903 changed everyone. Some changed in obvious and dramatic ways, while others changed in more subtle and internal ways. But none stayed the same. Coleman thought that this was the real sign of cases that mattered. Those that not only solved legal problems but also made us face deeper truths about the world and ourselves. The 1920s were a time of wealth for many parts of the United States, but they also made people more worried. The world seemed to be moving faster and changing in ways that made some people happy and others long for the past. Coleman, who is now in his 60s, watched these changes happen from his small house on the edge of Lafayette. He kept to a quiet schedule, spending the mornings gardening, the afternoons reading, and the occasional visit from former coworkers who wanted to spend time with him or get his advice. Coleman learned that Thomas Hartwell had died in 1923. It wasn't a surprise because Thomas had been having health problems for a while, but it still made me very sad. Coleman went to the funeral in the southern part of the state. He was one of the few people there. There was a single tree in a small rural cemetery that offered shade over Thomas's simple gravestones. His gravestone only had his name and the dates that marked his time on Earth. It didn't say anything about Margaret. After the funeral, Thomas's executor gave Coleman a sealed envelope. There was a short letter from Thomas inside that he wrote a few months before he died. He thanked Coleman again for looking for the truth, even when it hurt, and he made a simple request, that Coleman, if he could, visit the place where Margaret was buried every now and then, not to relive the trauma, but just to make sure she wasn't completely forgotten. It was a moving request from a man who had never been able to get over his loss. Coleman did what they asked. He would go to Morgan County a few times a year, when the seasons changed. The area where Merrick's country house used to be was now completely overgrown. The forest had taken back its land, leaving no physical signs of what had happened there. Coleman, on the other hand, knew exactly where it was. He would stand there for a few minutes without saying anything, thinking about Margaret and all the lives that had been changed or interrupted by other people's greed and fear. He never told anyone about these private times of reflection. The Great Depression came at the end of the decade and caused a lot of economic problems. Like many other cities, Lafayette suffered. Businesses went out of business, families had a hard time, and the hopeful mood from the past few years quickly faded. Coleman, who lived simply on his retirement pension, felt the effects but was able to get through them. He saw that hard times could bring out the best in people, like when neighbors came together to help each other, but they could also make some people make bad choices. Coleman saw an increase in certain types of crime during those hard years. These included petty fraud, trust schemes, and people trying to stay alive by being dishonest. Not as big as the Blackwood operation, but the same ideas are still there. People were weak when they were desperate, and there was always someone who would take advantage of that weakness. He sometimes talked to the current county sheriff and gave him advice based on his own experiences, but he was careful not to seem pushy. Samuel Brennan, who is now a retired senior editor, went to see Coleman in 1932. The two men were in their 70s and sat on Coleman's porch on a hot summer afternoon, drinking iced tea and talking about old times. Brennan said that the Hartwell case was the only story that had such a big effect on him. There were other assignments that were important, and some that had a bigger social or political impact, but that case was the one that changed my life the most. They talked about how things have changed since then. In some ways, new technologies made investigations easier, but in other ways they made them more difficult. Telephones that let people talk to each other right away, cars that let people travel quickly, and more centralized records all helped stop frauds like the ones Blackwood had planned. But it also made it possible for crimes that people in 1903 couldn't have imagined to happen. Brennan said that he still sometimes got letters from readers asking about the case, wanting to know more about certain parts of it or looking for lessons that could help them in their own lives. He always answered patiently because he saw it as part of his job as a journalist who had helped tell that story. Some of these letters were from law students or people who wanted to be investigators who were using the case as a way to learn how to break up a criminal conspiracy through hard work and determination. Coleman talked about something he didn't usually talk about: his nightmares. Even decades later, he sometimes dreamed about that night in Morgan County when he went down to the basement with his flashlight, not knowing what he would find but being afraid of the worst. The details of the dreams were always a little different, but the feeling of fear and the eventual confirmation of his worst fears stayed the same. Brennan listened in silence, understanding that he too was carrying the weight of those events in ways that made him think about them at unexpected times. The conversation naturally turned to deeper philosophical issues. What made people willing to hurt others to get what they wanted? Was it just greed, or was there more to it than that? Coleman shared his thoughts, which he had formed over many years. He thought that most people didn't start out as criminals. They made small decisions, gave in a little, and made excuses that made sense at the time. But every choice made the next one a little easier, and before they knew it, they were no longer the same person they had been. Brennan agreed and said that many of the criminals he had met as a journalist seemed perfectly normal on the outside. They had families, were involved in their communities, and looked good. It was both impressive and scary how well people could compartmentalize. People could do horrible things and then go back to their normal lives as if nothing had happened, keeping two completely separate realities in their heads. The two men said goodbye to each other when Brennan left that afternoon, knowing they probably wouldn't see each other again. Both were getting older, and their health was getting worse. But there was a sense of satisfaction in the separation, an unspoken understanding that they had shared something important, an experience that had brought them together in deep and lasting ways. They had worked together to bring out the truth at a time when it was very important, and this had made a bond that time could not completely break. Coleman's last years were mostly quiet. He kept going to Morgan County every now and then, as Thomas Hartwell had asked him to. He kept in touch with some people whose lives had been affected by the case, and he took the time to finish his written memoirs. These were not meant to be published, but rather as a personal record for anyone who might be interested in the future. He honestly talked about the mistakes he made during the investigation, the paths he should have taken sooner, and the signs he should have seen sooner in these memoirs. He didn't try to make himself look like an unbreakable hero. Instead, he showed himself to be an imperfect man who was doing the best he could with what he had and what he knew. He was always learning and sometimes fell, but he always got back up to keep going. He wrote extensively about Margaret, attempting to capture her humanity beyond the mystery, drawing on conversations with Thomas and others who knew her. Coleman painted a portrait of an intelligent woman who had made complicated choices under difficult circumstances. She was neither a completely innocent victim nor an utterly guilty accomplice, but something more nuanced and human. And it was this complexity that made her story so powerful and memorable. Coleman died on a calm autumn morning in 1936. He fell asleep in his favorite chair on the porch with an open book on his lap and the sun warming his face. For a man who had spent so many years fighting violence and injustice, it was a peaceful end. As he had asked, his papers and memoirs were given to the county library, where anyone could read them. The Hartwell case had effects that lasted in ways that were not expected. It became a standard study in criminal investigation classes that were starting to pop up at colleges and universities all over the country. Researchers looked at the methods used, the lessons learned, and how important it is to keep going when the evidence is complicated and contradictory. The story had grown beyond its original meaning to become something bigger, a story about looking for the truth in a world where it often hides in the shadows. But the case also struck a chord with people on an emotional and human level, in addition to the technical and educational ones. It was a story about how things that people can't control can ruin their lives, how secrets from the past never really stay buried, how fragile human life is, and how quickly everything we know can change because of things we can't see coming or protect against. One by one, the people who lived through those events died. Samuel Brennan died in 1938, leaving behind decades of great journalism. Catherine Reynolds in 1941, having quietly helped make changes that made it harder for similar frauds to happen. Helena Crane died in 1945 after spending her whole life teaching students in Lafayette. Every time someone left, they took a little bit of the memory of the events with them. All that was left were written records and stories told by other people. Over the years, the farm where Margaret and Thomas Hartwell lived changed hands many times. Every new family that moved there brought their own hopes and dreams, and they made new memories on land that had a lot of history that most people didn't know about. The property became just another piece of rural land in Indiana, just like thousands of others, and maybe that was how it should have been. Life went on, as it always does, without caring about the human dramas that were happening on its surface. The area in Morgan County where the farmhouse used to be is still thick forest. Some hikers walked by without knowing what that place meant. Nature kept its secrets by covering up human scars with layers of fallen leaves and new growth. This ability of the earth to take in and hide things was a kind of mercy, as it let time soften the sharp edges of past tragedies. But for people who knew the story, who had read the accounts or heard the stories that had been passed down through the years, that place would never be just a normal forest. It would always be marked by things that happened there. A silent reminder that dark stories are everywhere, just below the surface of everyday life, waiting for someone curious or persistent enough to find them. And maybe that's the real lesson of this disturbing story, that there are mysteries in the world that can't be easily explained, that people can be very kind and do very bad things, that the search for truth is always important for a society that wants to be fair, and that remembering even sad events is important because it reminds us how fragile and precious human life is. Subsequent generations discovered their own interpretations of this narrative. New mysteries appeared in new situations, but the basic ideas stayed the same. Questioning what you see, following the evidence even when it's hard, and not giving up when things seem impossible. Decades later, these lessons, which came from Coleman's and others' experiences, were still important. Even now, as we look back through the years, the case is still interesting because of the mystery and investigation it involves and what it shows about people and society at the time. It was a time of change, when old ways of life met new ones, and when technology started to change how people talked to each other and how crimes were committed and solved. The case captured this moment of change in ways that go beyond the details of the case. And even though the names and places are specific to that time and place, the themes are universal and timeless. Greed, fear, courage, perseverance, and the search for justice in a world that isn't perfect. These are things that have always been true for people, and that still connect us to people who lived more than 100 years ago in ways that are still very important. The mystery of Indiana in 1903 lives on through these preserved stories, the lessons learned, and the changes it made in how society deals with fraud and witness protection. But more importantly, it lives on as a reminder that every life is important, every story should be told, and the truth, no matter how dark, is always worth looking for. If you thought this story was interesting and surprising, you might want to subscribe to the channel. Please leave a comment with your thoughts on this complicated story. If you know someone who likes investigative stories that look at the darker side of human nature, please share this video. There are always more mysteries to discover and stories that are hidden in the folds of time, waiting to be told.